Management today, and some of the objectives for this module are given. First of all, I'm going to give you an introduction to mobility management, and we are going to look at some handover mechanisms in LTE, and then the last part of the class we'll have a look at security. So we start off with mobility management. So what is mobility management? So essentially we know that in any mobile network you need a mechanism. So mobility management is needed because users are essentially moving around in a mobile network, and when they move around, it creates added complexity in the network, because if as a user moves within a cell, when they get to the edge of the cell, we might find out that their connection to the base station might not be very good, and we might have to transfer that radio connection to another base station. So that's one aspect that is important. That's assuming a user is in a call. But the second possibility, the user is not in a call. We also want to have an idea where a user is located, because we need to know where a user is located so that we can page that user in case of an incoming call. So in terms of handover and in terms of mobility, there are different procedures or mechanisms that are needed in any mobile network. And in LTE, we have essentially two types of handovers. We have something called intra-EUTRA handovers. That's this term here. Okay, that means intra means within the LTE network, and we also have to have the possibility that a handover has to take place between an LTE network and another network, maybe a UMTS network or a GSM network, and that is referred to as a inter-RAT handover. Okay, because we are going from one radio access RAT stands for radio access technology, so you're moving from one radio access technology to another radio access technology. So apart from handover, that's when you have an active connection. The other possibility is when you don't have an active connection and you're moving around. In that case, we need mechanisms. One mechanism we need is something called cell reselection mechanism. So each cell, okay, and when it moves around, it needs to reselect, it needs to perform cell reselection. And a mobile that's switched on and is also in idle mode, and when a UE is not having a connection with the network needs to sometimes contact the UE, and it needs a mechanism called a paging mechanism to be able to do that. And so we're going to have a look at these mechanisms today. Okay, now before we get into this, previously we talked about RRC states, okay, and RRC idle and RRC connected. Now we're going to talk about mobility management states. So in LTE, they've defined two EPS mobility management states, or EMM. The first state is called a EMM deregistered state. Now, in the EMM deregistered state, the UE is not reachable, and so the MME does not know anything about the UE. So it cannot contact it. The next state is the EMM registered state. So this is what happens once you perform an attach. When a UE performs an attach, the UE moves into an EMM registered state. And at this point, when you get registered with an MME, the location of the UE is known by the MME at something called tracking area level. Okay, we talked a little bit about tracking area level in some of the earlier classes. and we said that when you don't have an active connection with the network, that means you don't have a radio link and you're transmitting and receiving data, you only need to be known at tracking area level, okay? And a tracking area is essentially a group of cells, okay? So the UE is known at tracking area level, and all of the network elements, the UE, the MME, the S gateway and the P gateway, they all have the UE context. They know that there's such and such a UE and it's located in such and such a tracking area, because the UE is now effectively registered. Okay, so these are the two important states. When you initially switch on your mobile and you perform an attach state, you move from being in the EM deregistered state to the EM registered state, and when you're in the registered state, the network knows you at tracking area level. Obviously, if this attach was to be rejected, or if you were to perform a detach, then you get pushed back into the EMM deregistered state. You pretty much can't do much when you're in the EMM deregistered state. The next set of states, now the EMM are related to mobility management. The next set of states are referred to as connection management states. Okay, so this is associated with the fact that you are now establishing a connection to be able to transmit and receive data. Okay, so in terms of the ECM states, or connection management state, you are initially in the idle state, okay, and when you have an idle state, there is no signaling connection between the UE and the MME, okay, so you can't perform any signaling, but the UE continues to take measurements within the cell, and it continues to do this cell selection and reselection procedure, whereby UE always tries to select the best cell to camp on, waiting for things to happen. Okay, the things can happen either from a network perspective, that means there might be an incoming call, or maybe the UE can initiate a call. So for both those reasons, the UE has always got to be camping on the best possible cell, and that's why we need these cell selection and reselection mechanisms. Now, what happens when you want to establish a connection with the network? Okay, you move into the ECM connected state. Okay, so in the ECM connected state, you start establishing a signaling link with the MME, because you cannot, the first thing that you have to do before you can start transmitting packets is to establishing a signaling link with the MME, and the MME will allocate you the appropriate S gateway and P gateway. Okay, and again, as before, the UE location is known by the MME with an accuracy of the serving E and B. So you can see that when we move from the ECB idle to ECB connected state, the network starts becoming interested in you. Okay, because now you're no more known at tracking area level. Okay, you are now known at serving E node B level, or you're known at cell level. Okay, and this is the point at which you can now start doing handover procedures. So handovers only come in to place when you move into the ECM connected state. When you're in the ECM idle state, you do cell selection and cell reselection. So there's an important difference between these two procedures. Okay, so again, recapping, you move from ECM idle to ECM connected when a signaling connection is established. Okay, maybe when you do, initially it is established when you do perform an attach. As soon as you perform an attach, you get moved from ECM idle to ECM connected. But if the network notices that you haven't done something for a long time, it pushes you back into the ECM idle state, because in the ECM connected state the network has to do more functions for you. Okay, it's got to monitor you at cell level. Okay, so initially when you put the attach, okay, you get moved to the EMM registered state and also into the ECM connected state. But if you stay in the ECM connected state and you don't do much, there's a timer. It says this user is not performing anything. Let's push him back to ECM idle state. Okay, and you stay in the ECM idle state until you maybe do a PDP context activation. If you have to do a PDP context activation, you've got to move into the ECM connected state. So the important thing to remember is a signaling bearer, the NAS signaling bearer, okay, non-access stratum signaling connection between the UE and the MME is only established when you go into the ECM connected state. Okay, so let's go on. So just to recap the different states, we have the mobility management deregistered state, where in which that's like when you're switched off, the network has no knowledge of where you are or what you're doing. When you get registered, the network knows you where you are. It probably knows you at tracking area level. When you do a connected, you also have to be in RRC connected state. Here, the network knows you at E node B level, and handovers start becoming a possibility. And obviously, if you stay in the ECM connected state and you don't do anything for long, you get pushed back into the ECM idle state, and at the same time, RRC, it also means that you move into the RRC idle state. Here, you're known at tracking area level, and the only thing that you can do is here is paging, saying that hey, there's a call coming for me. I can hear that, or if you change your tracking area, then you can do a tracking area update. So
what is the difference between ECM connected and RRC connected?
We move on to handover. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at, okay, there's a definition up here. Okay, it says here the handover is a process of transferring an ongoing call or data session from one cell connected one cell to another. Okay. Okay. One of the things you want to do handover is to provide continuity of service. Why is there a need for handovers? Okay. Why should you continue to have if you have a bad link, what happens? Almost all the packets that you're transmitting are getting dropped or getting corrupted, and you can't recover the original message. So the quality of your link is deteriorating. Okay, so one reason why we have handovers is for quality reasons. Okay, this applies to any network, whether it's 2G or 3G or 4G. We have handovers for quality reasons. The second reason why we have handovers, sometimes we could have excellent quality. We could have excellent quality, but we still want to. What's the second reason? We could have a situation where you have a whole lot of people suddenly walk into a cell, okay, and you don't have sufficient capacity. Everybody's quality is excellent. Everybody has excellent radio links to the base station, but there is not enough. In the case of GSM, not enough time slot. In the case of wideband CDMA, it could be not enough channel codes. In the case of LT, it could be not enough resource blocks, okay, to give to every user. So what we do in that case, we do handovers due to capacity reasons, okay, or due to traffic reasons. Or the other possibility is congestion. When there's way too much traffic in a cell, the maximum capacity has been exceeded, we want to try and pull some of the users into adjacent cells. Okay, now in that process, they might go from having a good connection to having a poor connection with a neighboring cell. Okay, but that is something that has to be done in a mobile network. Okay, now there's a third type of handover that takes place.
In between different.
Sometimes you also have handovers due to speed. Okay, if the network detects that a user is moving very fast, okay, then what will happen is if they are being serviced by small cells, by microcells, you can see that there's going to be a lot of handover messages going to be taking place. So what happens is you get handed over from smaller cells to a larger cell, big umbrella cells, okay, and that also happens especially in the case of GSM network. When you have overlay networks, okay, when we have maybe a 900 megahertz network, and overlaid on top of it you have an 1800 megahertz network. Now usually the 900 megahertz network have a larger coverage compared to the 1800 megahertz cells. So you might have, when the network detects a user is moving fast, they may move it. The user could be handed over from a one cell with a smaller coverage area to a cell with a larger coverage area. Okay, so that's handover due to speed is also possible. Yeah. Okay. Now in UMTS we had three types of types of handovers. Do you remember those types of handovers? Yeah, we had something called soft handover, softer handover, and we had hard handover. Okay. Yeah, or even within the same frequency, there are, when you don't have an RNC to RNC connection, that's also a hard handover. Okay. Now the soft handover is a handover where you maintain two radio links. Okay, in the case of 3G networks, we had these soft handovers where a UE was simultaneously connected to two different base stations. Okay, and both uplink transmission and downlink transmission were simultaneously performed. Okay, that was called soft handover. Now in LTE, there are no soft handovers, and there are no softer handovers. There's only hard handovers in LTE. Okay. It might be possible in the future they might bring it back, but for the time being there is only hard handovers in LTE. Okay, so here I was, yes, I was talking about handovers. So now one of the important things about handover is it says here it should be transparent to the end user. What do we mean by that? A handover is a procedure that must be performed without the user being aware that it is being performed. Okay, so the user must not know. There is no need for the user to press a button in their mobile to perform a handover. Okay, it should take place completely. They should not be aware at all. In fact, if you're on a call and you're traveling from the city out to one of the suburbs, you may be going hundreds of handovers from here till then. It's possible, but you are not aware that handover is taking place. And the other aspect is service continuity. You don't want your calls to drop. And initially, whenever a new technology comes out, one of the biggest challenges they always have at the beginning is to make sure that call drops don't occur, because people get very upset when you have call drops. Okay, and they have to keep calling the same person many times when they're on the train. Okay, now the next point that we have here, it says that handover is network control and UE assisted. Especially in the case of LTE, are all performed at the network end. Okay, all the UE does is it gets told take measurements and inform the network, because the network cannot take downlink measurements. The network can take uplink measurements, but the network cannot perform downlink measurements. So the network asks the UE to perform the downlink measurements, and it tells the UE to give those messages back to the network. Now, in terms of handovers, again, there are many types of handovers in LTE. You can have intra-EU TRAN, that means within EU TRAN, inter-EU TRAN with other 3GPP technologies, and then the lowest one, which is probably the most complex one, is the interact with non-3GPP technologies. Okay. So here diagrammatically they are shown this way, the 3 handovers. So let's look at the intra EU tran handover. What needs to be performed in the intra EU tran handover? Now we've already discussed that the UE is RRC connected. So we know that when a UE is in one cell, and in this particular case the UE is communicating with E node B1. Okay, so there's a connection there, and at the same time it's got a signaling link to the MME, and it also has a data plane S1U data plane link to the serving gateway. So in the process of moving, so this UE is approaching the edge of the cell, a number of things have to be established. The first thing that you have to do is, as you move into this new cell, you are reporting your measurements, okay, and the E node B, the first thing that you have to do is you have to establish a signaling link between the new E node B and the MME, so that the new signaling messages can be sent to the MME, and then the old signaling link can be removed, and then you got to establish a data plane between the new or the target E node B and the serving gateway, and then the old data link can be removed for that particular UE. Remember, each UE has a separate signaling plane and a data plane. When they talk about handovers, we use these two terms, break before make and make before break. Okay, in 3G networks, the handovers were make before break. That means you make a connection with the new network first, because it allows you to have multiple connections at the same time, and only you may want to break an old connection. Whereas in the case of 4G, in the case of LTE, it's break before make. Okay, this is the only signaling diagram. Let's look at what happens in the handover process. Okay, if you understand one quite well, then it's quite easy to go and analyze some of the other handovers. There are hundreds of handover timing diagrams, and as long as you can understand one of them quite clearly, then it's quite easy to go and look at the other ones in more detail afterwards. Well, the first step in handovers is always measurements. Okay, so measurements are sent by the E node B to the source E node B, and at this point, remember we said that handovers are network control, UE assisted. So UE is sending the measurements uplink to the E node B, and here the E node B is continuously monitoring the measurements that it's receiving from the UE. Okay, and at some point it makes a decision. Now, in order to make that decision, there's a handover algorithm. Okay, and there are many different handover algorithms that are there. The very simple ones are very similar to the handover algorithms that are used in GSM. Okay, so you have the concept of you compare the signal strength from the source E node B and maybe the signaling strength from a target E node B, and if one is above the other by a threshold amount called a handover threshold, then you can make a handover decision. Now, when you've decided it's time to make a handover decision, the next thing we do, the source E node B does, because remember the decision was made at the source E node B. The source E node B then sends a message to the target E node B saying, look, I think we should do a handover now, because the signal strengths are really poor from me to this UE, and the signal strength from the UE to you are quite good. So the target E node B receives the message. Now at this point, when the target E node B receives this message, it might have a capacity issue. Okay, it might not have sufficient resource blocks. Maybe it's a congested cell. So at that point, it can say, no, I'm not willing to accept this handover request. I reject this request. In which case, the source E node B will continue to serve the UE, or the connection will die. Okay, so that's when you might have a dropped call. Okay, but that's something that you always want to try and avoid. As a network operator, you want to try and avoid dropped calls, because dropped calls statistics are not good for you. So at this point, the target E node B makes an admission control decision. Should I accept this new request or not? Do I have sufficient resources to give this new user who wants to come into my cell? And then the UE sends a response. Okay, most of the time it will be an accept response, but there is a possibility that it could be a reject response as well. And once that response comes in, the RRC reconfiguration handover command is sent to the UE, telling the UE, okay, now establish an RRC with the new target E node B. Okay, so this is the point at which the E node B starts to detach from the old cell. So this is a break operation that's taking place. Okay, and then it starts to synchronize with the new cell. So this is the make operation. So this is why we say break first and then make with the new one. Okay. Okay, and that's the same. Everybody should follow this model as well. Okay. Then you send the new RRC reconfiguration message to the target E node B. Okay, and at that point, the target E node B will allocate you the signaling radio bearers, and they'll be established. A new signaling link will be established, and then the target E node B will inform the MME, look, we need a path switch here. We need to switch the path through the target E node B, and the MME will inform the serving gateway, look, the user has changed cell. We need to update this in the UE context, and the UE plane will send a response back confirming it. Okay, and then the path switch request, which was sent by the target E node B, is acknowledged, and the UE, then the target E node B tells the source E node B, look, it's everything is clear now. We are ready to take this new user. MME knows about it, serving gateway knows about it, target E node B. So now you can release the UE context, everything that you know about the UE. Okay, and now all the all the resources held by the source E node B is released. At that point, we have a new UE. The handover is almost complete. One of the things the E node B asked the UE to do is to take measurements. Okay, and these are performed not only for intra frequency mobility but also inter-frequency mobility. Say, for example, if a UE has to be shifted to another frequency or to another RAT, you need to continuously perform these measurements. Okay, and the EU-TRAN decides what sort of measurements are going to be taken by the UE based on the type of cells. Okay, for example, a cell, if you have a cell that is at the edge of a LTE network and you know that you don't have coverage beyond that, that cell could be requesting UEs to also take measurements on other bands, say on the 3G bands, or sometimes even the 2G bands, so that you can have handover to those bands if necessary. So again, the types of measurements that are made are also controlled by the E node B. Okay, we move on. Next thing we're going to look at is when you're in the RRC connected state, which is the important state at which you can have a connection, what are the things that can happen? Well, the most important thing is that when you're in the RRC connected state, you can transmit or receive data from the UE, and because you're connected, you perform network control mobility or network control handover is performed. And you also, when you're in the RRC connected state, you take measurements of your neighbor cells, and you report them as well. So when you move to the RRC idle state, that's when the UE is still attached to the network, and at any time a radio link can be re-established. In case of, for example, incoming traffic, when you have incoming traffic, and there's a paging message, you will move from RRC idle state to RRC connected state. Okay, so yeah. So here's a diagram that shows what happens if you're an idle UE in a cell in a network. What happens when you have some incoming packet traffic? Okay, so we know that all of the incoming packet will have to initially come through the packet gateway and to the serving gateway. The serving gateway has no idea where this UE is because the UE is idle. Okay, but it knows the MME with which it had a link with before, so it contacts the MME, the tracking area relevant to that MME, and that MME goes and sends a paging message on every cell associated with the tracking area. And these paging messages are sent on every cell associated with the tracking area, and then the UE picks up that paging message and says, this paging is for me, I better respond to this particular paging message. So as we said, the UE is always, even when you are in the idle state, the two things that you do is first thing you do is you always look out for the paging messages which are sent on the packet data PDSCH channel, and those are sent in a specific position, so the UE knows that paging messages are sent in this particular cycle, in this particular position of the resource block, and it monitors that. And once it monitors that there is a packet, then it responds to that paging message. How does it respond to the paging message? Well, it sends, the first thing that it has to do is it has to establish a service request. So it sends a service request message back to the eNode B, and at that point a link with the MME is established, and then the rest of the procedure can carry on to establish a link. So as I said, we talked about this tracking area concept earlier. So when you are in idle mode, the network knows you where at tracking area level. So here in this particular example, we have 3 tracking areas. Okay, so a UE is moving from one cell to another cell. At which tracking area is the UE known when it's here? Tracking area 1, and while it's here, again, tracking area 1, and when it moves here, okay, so this is the point at which it has changed tracking area. So when it was moving here, it was moving from one cell to another cell, but the tracking area was essentially the same. Okay, only when it goes across a traffic area boundary, like across here or across here, do we need to update the databases in the network? Okay, there's no need to update databases in the network when you go across cell when you're in the idle state. Okay, now it's quite different when you're in the connected state, because in the connected state you know the user's location at E node B level or cell level. Okay, so the question is, when we have to page a user, where do we page a user? At tracking area level. Okay, so once the system knows that the user is in this particular tracking area, you only page in the cells that form that tracking area. You don't need to page in other cells. Okay, this way you can minimize the amount of paging that you do. Okay, so the other thing that also happens while you are in idle state is cell reselection. Okay, so the cell selects the best cell to camp on. So the UE in idle mode is measuring the selected cell and adjacent cells to always select the best cell to camp on. When the UE selects a cell, first thing it does is it checks the tracking area identifier, and we talked about the tracking area identifier in one of the previous classes. Okay, if the tracking area identifier that a UE has stored in its SIM card is different to the tracking area identifier that it is receiving in the broadcast, then it performs a tracking area update. Okay, tracking area update is a procedure by which the UE, again, when you do a tracking area update, you need to move from the idle state to the connected state, because you've got to establish a signaling bearer with MME, and a tracking area update is then performed. Okay, these two concepts are probably the most important concepts in this lecture. We're just going to look at what happens when we have to do handovers between different rats. Okay, now there are detailed, if you look at the standard documents, there are very detailed documents have handover. So here we have a user here, user Alice, I think. User Alice was connected either to an LTE network, and the user Alice moves outside the coverage of the EU-TRAN network. Okay, and they move into the UMTS coverage area. So as they do that, the handover now, there are different ways that it can be performed. One way that the connection can be established is the connection can go through the 3G node B, which is the base station in 3G network is called a node B or NB, and then it goes through the RNC through to the SGSN. The SGSN is the equivalent of the serving gateway, and from the SGSN, the connection can be routed to the P gateway or the GGSN. Okay, it's possible that these two units, the P gateway and the GGSN, could be the same unit, and then out to the data services. So this is one possibility. Okay, where you are trying to bypass as much of the LTE network and just go out to the GGSN. The second possibility that you can have is where the 3G connection, you go up all the way up to the SGSN, and then via the S3, S4 interfaces, you connect to the serving gateway. Okay, so there's a connection, there's S3, S4 interface that allows connection between the SGSN and the serving gateway, and here the connection goes directly here and out to the P gateway. That's the second mechanism by which the new link can be established. Okay. The third possibility is from the RNC in the 3G network, we could have a direct tunnel established to the serving gateway. Okay, and out through. So there are three mechanisms, three ways that we can have this new connection established when we have to do either wideband CDMA to LTE handover, or from an LTE to wideband handover. Okay, sorry, cell selection is a process by which when you switch on a UE, the mobile has to select the cell on which it's going to camp on. So how does it do it? Well, initially what it does, it searches for a suitable selected suitable cell of the selected PLMN, okay, and chooses that cell to provide the available services. Now, thereafter, it will tune to the control channel of that particular cell. So essentially, when a mobile is switched on, it has knowledge of some in the SIM card. It has knowledge of the preferred PLMN, okay, and it tries to look for a cell with. Okay, and the next procedure is the cell reselection process. So the cell reselection process happens because a UE is always looking for a better cell to camp on. So as the UE is moving, it tries to detect and at not only on the same frequency but also on other frequency bands and on other rats, it tries to look for a better cell. Okay, and the whole reason why we do it is we're always trying to look for a better cell to camp on. Okay. Roaming. We move on to roaming. Okay, in roaming, there are two possibilities. So the question I want to ask you is, what's the difference between handover and roaming? And now you are in a visited PLMN. Okay, so what happens now? When you're in a visited PLMN, what's the first node that you're going to communicate with? You're going to go through your roaming node B, okay, and then the next point is your serving gateway. Now from your serving gateway, there are two possibilities. First possibility is you may go through the P gateway in your home network, okay, or the other possibility which is given is where you go through the P gateway in the visited network, okay. Now when would you use either of these options? Yeah, it could depend on where your data is coming to or where your data is going to, okay, but there could also be settings. There could also be settings in the SIM, okay. Now sometimes for the subscriber profile, you can set it such that you always use the P gateway in the home network. Okay, so this is the point that's at the bottom here. P gateway in HPLMN. That means you've got to always route that call to the P gateway in the home network. The second possibility is it allows you to use the P gateway in your visited PLMN, and that's why the call has been routed that way. The next part, the last part of this is the security part. When we have a situation where data is transmitted, especially packet switch data is transmitted, there's a number of risks associated with the data transmission. We have something called eavesdropping. The data can be transferred, the data can be manipulated. Another type of attack, privacy, is where if somebody is able to monitor the messages associated with cell selection or cell reselection or handover, then somebody can track your movement. These are some security threats associated with wireless communication, and we need to have mechanisms to overcome these problems. So the three main procedures that are used in mobile networks and other network and data networks as well are authentication, ciphering, integrity protection. Okay, and there's also something called authorization, which is not given here. So what do these mean? So the first one is authentication. So when we talk about authentication, what do we mean? Now when you guys come and sit your exam or your midterm exam or any other exam, we have to do authentication, isn't it? How do I do authentication? How do I authenticate who you are? First thing I have to do is I have to check that the person's photograph on the ID matches the person who's sitting there. Authentication is essentially a process by which you have to confirm that this person is who they are. Okay? Now, this kind of authentication that we do with the face has to be done in a mobile network. Okay? In a mobile network, we can't ask to see a person's face. The network can't ask to see a person's face every time it wants to authenticate somebody. So it's got to use some other mechanism. Now, the next thing that we have to do in a mobile network is ciphering. So ciphering is a process by which we ensure that the message is protected so nobody can read it. So somebody can't pick up your packet and read the contents of it because the message is ciphered. Yeah? Then there's also integrity protection. What sort of attack does integrity protection overcome? Manipulation, okay? Because it gives you the integrity of the message is preserved. So if somebody was to manipulate that message or change it, then the network can detect that this message was changed, okay? So these are the three mechanisms. Yeah. Okay, we move on. So in the LTE network, it was designed that you can use a new SIM card, or you should be able to use your old used SIM card as well. Okay, so but there are some differences between the security in a 3G network and security in a 4G network, and we'll have a look at that soon. Okay, so what is different? Now we have something called mutual authentication in both UTRAN or in both 3G as well as 4G network. What do we mean by mutual authentication? The UE has to authenticate, the network has to authenticate the UE, and the UE has to authenticate the network. It's just like when you're sitting in the exam room and I come to check your, one of the things you guys should always do, if a policeman comes and knocks at your door and asks for some information, he wants to authenticate you, you should also authenticate him first, okay? Because it could be somebody dressed as a rogue policeman, okay? So mutual authentication is a process by which both the parties involved authenticate each other, okay? So this is done in 3G and it's going to be done in 4G as well, okay? Because the equipment required to set up a base station is getting smaller and smaller, okay? It will be possible in the future. There will be definitely lots of scammers and probably criminal organizations that will set up their own base stations. The main purpose is to try and it's called identity theft. You want to capture the identity of users who are passing by, okay? And so that's why this concept of mutual authentication has become very important in future networks. Now, one of the things that are different here is that in 3G networks, we didn't separate the user plane and the control plane. Okay, the same keys were used for both user plane and control plane. Whereas in the 4G network, we are going to have different keys. Okay, we're going to have different keys that are used to encrypt the user plane, and different keys that are used to encrypt the control plane. And we're also going to have a separation between different serving networks. So when you move from one serving network to another serving network, you won't be able to use the same set of keys. Okay, because one of the things that gets encoded into the keys that are derived is the identity of the serving network. The other aspect is you're going to have larger size keys. Okay, now you have, over a period of time, we have gone from 32-bit keys to 64-bit keys to 128-bit keys to 250. As technology evolves, people devise faster and faster means of breaking keys. Okay, so we've had to go into larger and larger keys. So for the time being, maybe 256-bit keys are sufficient, but maybe in a couple of years' time, we may have to use a larger size, even larger size key than what we're using now. Okay. So we have this diagram here shows the different security procedures. So we have mutual authentication is performed between the UE and the MME. Okay, as I said, the UE authenticates the network and the network authenticates the UE. We have integrity and ciphering message being performed between the UE and the MME. So all the messages, all the signaling messages that are sent between the UE and the MME are ciphered and integrity protected. And there's also integrity and ciphering both on the control plane and the user plane across the interface. Security mechanisms that were there in 3G network. In a 3G network, we had something called RAN, a random number, and we had a sequence number, SQN, and all of these along with a secret key. Now this secret key is only stored in two places in the network. The first place it's stored is the SIM card. The second place where it's stored is the authentication center. And all of this information goes into a number of algorithms in the authentication center, and they generate 4 pieces of information. So you have something called the signed result, you have a ciphering key, you have an integrity key, and you have something called an authentication network key as well. So these 4 pieces of information along with the RAND are called the authentication vectors. Okay, these are 5 pieces of security information. They're called authentication vectors, but they're more. They should have been called security vectors because these 5 pieces of information are the ones that provide most of the security for a 3G network. So you have the ciphering key CK that's used to cipher everything that's transmitted on the interface. You have the integrity key that's used to check for integrity checking. This one, the AUTN, is used by the UE to authenticate the network, and the signed result or XR, this one is used by the network to authenticate the UE. And the random number is a random number input that goes into every time these algorithms are run. So how does it work? Well, in the case of LTE, we take the basic ideas of the UMTS security, these 5 pieces of information from UMTS security, and we put these into an algorithm called KDF, okay, and what's something called KASME. Now all of these acronyms, KDF stands for key derivation function, and this is the case. KSME along with the signed result, the AUTN RAND, all of these now form the LTE authentication vector. Again, I believe this shouldn't be called an authentication vector. should be called a security vector because it has everything related to authentication, ciphering, and integrity protection in it. So how does authentication work in the case of LTE? Okay, I'm going to try and so in the case of authentication, whenever the MME receives a request from a UE, the MME goes to the HLR and says, okay, give me some information to authenticate the user. And when it does that, now this is a difference which is not there in the 3G network. It sends the IMSI, okay, but it also sends the serving network identity, okay. So one of the things that changed from 3G to 4G is that we use the serving network identity as part of the keys that are derived, okay, and all of this is sent to the HSS, and the HSS now derives these quartets, okay. Now in the case of GSM, we used to say the security were triplets because there were 3 pieces of information. In the case of a 3G network, we used to talk about a quintet because there were 5 pieces of security information. Now, in the case of a 4G network, we refer to them as quartet because there are 4 pieces of security information that are generated by the authentication and stored in the. So all of those information is sent. Now, even when you change from one MME to another MME in the process of handover or in the process of relocation, what the new MME will do is it will go to the old MME and it will check are there any security vectors that are available, okay, and so it will use the GUT, which we talked about in the second, which we talked about in some of the earlier classes. It will use the GUT, and from the GUT it will get the IMSI and whatever authentication data that is held by the old MME. Because if the old MME has already got authentication data about the user, there's no need to go back to the HLR database to get new authentication vectors. So once the MME has the authentication information, now remember there are 2 ways that the MME can get the authentication. It can either go to the HLR and get it, or it can get it from an old MME if the user is being transferred from another MME. So once you get the authentication information, what do you do with it? Well, the MME, remember the authentication is performed between which 2 points in the network? Between the UE and the MME. Okay, so the MME then sends the authentication information to the UE. Okay, so this will have, it doesn't send all of it, it only sends a RAND, whatever the UE needs. Obviously the UE needs a RAND because it's got to generate the signed response for that. It also needs the AUTN, okay, because AUTN is the one that the UE is going to authenticate the network, and it also sends the KSME part of the network, part of the key. Now at the UE, the first thing that it does is based on the RAND, it will calculate its own AUTN, and if the AUTN that the UE has computed matches with the AUTN that was sent, then it has authenticated the network, and so that's where the network authentication is performed. But thereafter the UET computes its signed result, and it sends the signed result back to the MME, and at the MME we compare the signed result that we obtain from the UE with the signed result that we have stored in the network, and if those 2 match, then we've essentially completed the mutual authentication of the UE.